Yes. So I have some ideas that I think will interest you. I have no equations, no propositions, no theorems, no axioms, no figures. But the ideas may be interesting anyway. There were 40 candidates for mayor of New York City in February. Eventually, it was reduced to 24, 13 in the Democratic primary, 2 in the Republican primary, and 9 independents. I don't think anybody in New York evaluated all 24 candidates, but we had an election among 24 candidates. What should people who are trying to come up with good ways of making collective decisions advise politicians to do about situations where there's such a multiplicity of candidates that you can't reasonably expect everybody or even anybody to evaluate them? There have been some interesting developments in this general direction. In California, they adopted a rule known as a blanket primary. Instead of having a primary for the Democrats and a primary for the Republicans, they put all the candidates into one primary. And the 2 leading candidates from that primary then have a runoff to determine who wins. So you can see that, well, in New York City, I've heard that there are about 6 times as many Democrats as Republicans. And that means that whoever wins the Democratic primary is likely to, almost certainly going to be the mayor without any input from the Republicans as to who that candidate ought to be. And you can see that if there had been a blanket primary instead of separate party primaries, there would have been an opportunity for Republicans as well as Democrats to participate if they wanted to. But you also have the problem that as we run primaries, well, as we run elections, usually we just have one vote for every candidate. You just vote for, every voter votes for one candidate. It's done differently now in New York City. In the primaries, they had instant runoff voting so that the voters could rank the candidates. So if you have a blanket primary with instant runoff voting, you would have a chance for all the voters to vote for their first choice and then to participate also as the field shrank. But instant runoff voting isn't necessarily the best way to shrink the field down to one candidate. Another interesting development has happened in Alaska. In Alaska, they have adopted an idea that was proposed in the book, The Politics Industry by Catherine Gale and Michael Porter. I think I have that in the next. Anyway, Catherine Gale and Michael Porter propose that the blanket primary shrink the number of candidates to 5, and then instant runoff voting be used to further shrink the field from 5 to 1. I think that that's a very important idea. Alaska has adopted a version of it. They shrink the field down to 4, and then they have an instant runoff voting final election among the 4. So the general question that I'm asking is, what is the best way to shrink the field of candidates to something, say 5? And what is the best way of selecting a single candidate from those 5? One of the difficulties with the proposal of Gale and Porter, is that if you have a group, let's say the Greens, and there are 3 Green candidates, the Greens might feel that they have enough support to get 1 out of 5, but if all 3 of the Green candidates run, none of them will be on the ballot. So they would have to have their own private primary to choose among their 3 candidates before they got into the election. And it might be advantageous to have a general election in which everybody could participate in deciding which of the Greens is going to participate, which of the Socialists is going to participate, which of the Libertarians is going to participate, and so on. Instant runoff allows votes to be accumulated by similar candidates, but it has the potential for eliminating the Condorcet winner. Empirically, it doesn't happen very often. The Fair Vote organization in the United States has collected the results of about 190 elections in which there were more than 2 candidates. And we have the rankings of the voters of the candidates. We don't always have all the rankings. In many places, they allow only 3 voters to report 3 rankings. In some other places, they allow 5. A few places allow complete rankings, but usually there aren't that many candidates, and you can get a lot of information from even 3 ranking, the ranking of the voters of 3 candidates. Anyway, in every election in which Fair Vote has collected the ballots, there has been a Condorcet winner. And in all but one of them, instant runoff voting has selected the Condorcet winner. So instant runoff voting is pretty good. Might be nice to have a Condorcet consistent process instead. And it's interesting that Condorcet winners are indeed so prevalent. With all the time we spend on worrying about what to do when there isn't one, you wouldn't expect that they would be so prevalent. So if you want to know why they're prevalent, I have an answer for you. The reason is that empirically, it seems as if the distribution of voters' preferences is consistent with a spatial model with a normal distribution of voter ideal points. If you have a normal distribution of voter ideal points, then for any 2 candidates that you consider, the one who's closest to the mode of the distribution will have more votes than the one who's farther from the distribution. So the function of distance from the mode gives you a transitive order of the candidates that will then be reflected in the result. Now, when you look at the few elections we have where we know the rankings of the candidates, the preferences aren't exactly consistent with a spatial model, but the deviation from the spatial model is extremely slight. So there will be occasional instances where there's not a Condorcet winner. In elections with over 1,000 voters, I would guess that the probability of lacking a Condorcet winner is on the order of 1 in 1,000. So using a process that finds a Condorcet winner when there is one is likely to be a useful thing to do almost all the time.
Nick, can I ask
yes.
you a clarifying question? This is Hervé.
Yes.
What exactly is instant runoff? Is it one where you have to rank all the candidates? What do you mean exactly by instant runoff?
I'm sorry. It's also known as the alternative vote. Yeah, it's under instant runoff voting, you rank the candidates, and then you eliminate the candidate with the fewest first place votes. You could also call it the Hare system. I apologize.
Okay.
It's become
Okay,
very
okay, thank
widely
you. Yeah.
understood in the United States.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think it's important to have a process for winnowing the set of candidates down to 5 that ensures the inclusion of the Condorcet winner, and instant runoff voting doesn't do that. So one of the things I thought about was, so let's just concentrate on Condorcet winners. Pick the Condorcet winner, or if there isn't one, the closest thing to a Condorcet winner by one of the many processes of doing so. Minimax. The difficulty with selecting a sequence of Condorcet winners, the top candidates by the collective ranking, is that you might, if you had 60% Democrats and 40% Republicans, you might select 5 Democrats, because if the Democrats rank all the Democrats ahead of all the Republicans and you have a majority of Democrats, then the collective ranking is going to put all the Democrats ahead of all the Republicans. And it seems like that isn't a good idea. That it seems like it's a good idea to have a process that will give you some diversity in the set of candidates that are selected for the final round. So the next thing I thought of was instant runoff voting with protection for the Condorcet candidate. You say, well, find the Condorcet candidate and put that candidate in a special category, and then start eliminating candidates with few first place votes. And then we can have a set that is certain to include in the winner of instant runoff voting. The difficulty with that is that if you have a party, say Republicans in New York City, where they only have a small percentage of the electorate, instant runoff voting could cause them to pile all their votes onto one candidate, when it would be better, well, when they have enough support in general to support 2 candidates. It seems that instant runoff voting doesn't do as good a job as you would like of ensuring that groups are represented in the final pool with as many candidates as they ought to have. So that led me to the idea of the single transferable vote. Now, the single transferable vote is used in Australia and Ireland and Malta, but it's not widely known. And under the single transferable vote, the quota, there is a quota, and once you have a quota, you are in the field of winners. And if you have more than a quota of votes, your surplus votes can be distributed to other candidates. And candidates are eliminated if they don't have enough votes. If they have fewer votes than any other candidate, then somebody has to be eliminated. So the thing that I find most attractive is the idea of the single transferable vote with protection for the Condorcet candidate. So the candidate who beats all others in head-to-head contests might have very few first place votes and therefore be eliminated if you're in the business of eliminating candidates with few votes. So I favor a system in which you first examine all the votes and find the candidate who, if there is one, who beats all the others, and if there isn't one, who comes closest to beating all the others in some sense. And then apart from that, you look for, you might say, clumps of voters who, when they have their votes consolidated, constitute enough to deserve it, to have a candidate in the final round. Usually the quota for inclusion under the single transferable vote is one more than the number of candidates to be selected. But if you're going to select 5 and one is already selected from the as the Condorcet candidate, then you would have 1/5 rather than 1/6 as the quota for selection. So this is the version of reduction to a smaller set, and then selection from within that set. Well, this is reduction to a smaller set. We'll talk about selection from the set in a minute. But before then, I want to talk about one other idea that I considered and rejected. There's a very fancy version of STV called CPO STV that I invented, under which you compare every possible set of elected candidates with every other possible set of elected candidates in a tournament that might exceed the capacity of current computers. But I found a reason to reject that apart from its complexity, and that is that that system is designed to provide the result that comes closest to proportional representation. And I think that if you are conducting a primary for the purpose of identifying candidates to go into a final round, you don't want proportional representation quite as much as you want to identify clumps of voters with similar preferences who might possibly persuade their fellow citizens that their candidate is the right one. So with that in mind, I say no to CPO STV. So for the second round, when I developed this idea, I was recommending Minimax. As most of you know, Minimax is a rule that you select the candidate whose worst loss is least bad. But since then, I've heard about another idea that I think deserves consideration for its simplicity and for its ease of understanding for people who are familiar with instant runoff voting. Under instant runoff voting, you find the candidate with the fewest first place votes, eliminate that candidate and redistribute the votes. But you can eliminate the Condorcet winner. So a very slight deviation from instant runoff voting that is Condorcet consistent is to identify the 2 candidates at the bottom of the ranking who have the fewest first place votes and have a head-to-head runoff between them. Examine all the voters' preferences between those 2 candidates and eliminate the one who is less preferred in that head-to-head comparison. with that voting system, can you see that voting system is Condorcet consistent? If you have a Condorcet winner, that candidate will win all of his pairings with other candidates and wind up the winner. It is also Smith consistent. The Smith set is a set of candidates, the smallest set of candidates, such that every candidate in the set beats every candidate not in the set. It's the set of candidates in the top cycle, you could say. And if you take the two candidates from the bottom, every time you compare a candidate in the Smith set with a candidate outside the Smith set, the one inside the Smith set will win. So the eventual winner must be a candidate who is in the Smith set. And so this alternative voting mechanism, which is so new that I believe it does not have an official name yet, is something that I believe deserves consideration. We can call it perhaps I'm trying to think of the name I had thought of for it. Bottom two head-to-head runoff. That's a long name. Eventually we will have a name for it, I suppose, that is more memorable and not as long. And that's the end of my presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, yeah, so we have some advice about the name. Right. In the chat, call it butting. Other questions in the room or online?
May I ask? So you started by telling us that having 24 candidates is a big pack of candidates to rank, but then in order to reach this smaller blanket, you call it the blanket
blanket primary, yes.
Right. You still need to ask your voters to rank the 24. So my question would be, if you think that this is really too much, just because, it would imply to think of something about all of these 24 candidates, how about a simple approval voting in the first part of the process, when we are just eliminating things? I mean, what do you feel can be wrong with approval voting when perhaps you even impose the number of outcomes that you are supposed to approve?
Well, okay. Suppose you have 60% Democrats and 40% Republicans. The Democrats will approve all Democrats, Republicans, all Republicans. And in the final round, you'll have all Democrats and no Republicans.
Okay.
Can I follow up?
Yes.
As far as I understood, Hervé, the initial idea, at least how I perceive it, the idea of primaries is that, for example, I am a Republican voter and I know better Republican politicians than I know Democratic politicians. So let people who know Republican politicians first vote over Republican politicians and find a decent one, and people who know better Democratic politicians vote over Democratic politicians and find the better one, and then these two can stand against each other in a general vote. However, if we just have common primaries, I really see no difference between such like joint primaries and just having one big election, maybe with some complicated procedure.
Well, so let me get back to the dealing with the problem of multiple candidates and the fact that nobody can rank all 24 candidates either. So what this is really about is economizing appropriately on the effort to learn about candidates. It's somewhat like the previous paper in that we rely on the efforts of others to determine which candidates deserve our attention. We each of us searches around and learns some things about a few candidates, and we gradually come to some idea as who are the interesting candidates. And one of the ways to pool our information is to have everybody get together and say, here's my ranking, here's my ranking. And so everybody submits a partial ranking of the candidates they have come to know. And then we have some process of combining these partial rankings into an overall decision as to which contenders deserve the further consideration of the whole electorate. Let me point out something again with respect to the recent primary in New York City. The final round had two candidates who differed by only 1%. So it's possible that if the Republicans had participated, you could have had a different outcome. In this case, that's not likely because the candidate who won was the more centrist, and the candidate who lost was the more left candidate. So the Republicans probably would have voted for the one who won, but it could have gone the other way too. So we need a way to build our information, make use of what people are willing to offer in the way of efforts to come to know some of the candidates, and then in some way combine the information we have accumulated. And the idea of the single transferable vote as a way of identifying pockets of interesting ideas is the best that I've been able to come up with so far as I see it.
Can I continue with a question which is in some sense not really about the talk, but it's about your experience of studying concrete elections and seeing the reactions of politicians and so forth. You mentioned that in this recent New York election, in some sense, the Electoral Commission or whoever is in charge of designing the voting rule had a specific concern, and it seems as if some of the ideas that in the field of social choice, of voting and so forth, some of the academic ideas that have been played with for so long are starting to have an influence. Is it also your impression that in some sense we are on the right path in terms of making our message felt and listened to out there, or
Yeah.
would you be
Yeah, well, we are in a time of concern for what the voting rule ought to be. But as it happens, the idea that has the most political support is instant runoff voting. And I think it's problematic. But there are other ideas out there that have captured bits of interest here and there and are being adopted in communities here and there. So I would say that it is a time of ferment, but the ideas that are gaining political support are ideas that most of us would rank rather lowly among our rankings of ways of making collective decisions.
Okay. And when you say we are in such a time, I mean, this is not circumstantial with the very, very current and sort of instantaneous debate on the reform of voting bills in various states. I mean, you're taking a longer horizon there, right? It's not really circumstantial on the,
No,
okay.
the organization Fair Vote, which promotes instant runoff voting, has been around for about 15, 20 years or so. So it's an organization that is a focal point. But there are other smaller focal points as well. We professors are relatively little listened to.
Okay, all right. So we need to make our voice more heard and continue
Yeah.
until it works.
Yes.
All right. Is there any other? I don't think we have other questions.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything in the chat and in the room. So, well, thanks everyone for attending the session. Hervé, Alex, would you say a few words to conclude the conference?
I mean, yeah, I mean, general thanks to everybody. I mean, it's very nice to see you again, Nick. I mean, it's been a long time.
Thank you, Hervé. Yes.
Maybe sometime it's going to be in person. And fortunately, we have been saying that to most of the participants, right? Because we only had 2 talks, which were done in person, but times will change. So the other participants, some of them are still there, some of them are not. We cannot say, of course. And we thank them all and hoping for a next conference in the more traditional context. Thank you again and see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.